The road into Cedar Falls, Montana ran straight and narrow through the heart of the valley, cutting between walls of dark pine that rose on either side like the edges of something ancient and unmoved. In late January, the light came low and pale across the mountains, barely enough to cast a proper shadow. Snow had fallen the night before, not the soft and gentle kind that drifted quietly to earth, but the hard, wind-driven kind that packed itself into the crevices of wooden fences and lay flat and dense across open fields. The sky above the valley was the color of old iron. From inside the county services vehicle, a girl watched all of it. She sat in the back seat with her hands folded in her lap, a small canvas backpack pressed between her feet and the seat in front of her. Her name was Nora Holt. She was 10 years old. She had long, dark brown hair that fell past her shoulders, and her skin was pale in the way that winter children sometimes are carrying the memory of warmer seasons somewhere beneath the surface. Her eyes were gray with the faintest trace of blue, and they moved steadily across the passing landscape with the quiet, measuring attention of someone twice her age. She was not afraid. That was the first thing the caseworker, a tired woman named Deborah, had noted in her file 3 weeks earlier. Not fearful, not crying, not clinging, just watching, just waiting, as though the world had done its worst and she had decided somewhere into the cold arithmetic of her 10-year-old mind that the safest response was silence. Deborah glanced in the rearview mirror. Nora didn't look back. The trees thickened as the road curved west toward the edge of town. Through the window, Nora saw a gas station with a single pump, a diner with fogged glass, a hardware store with a hand-painted sign swinging in the wind. Cedar Falls was not a large place. It did not pretend to be. The kind of town where people knew each other's business and kept it mostly to themselves, where the mountains at the edge of the valley served as both a wall and a comfort, and where winter had a way of pressing people together whether they wished it or not. Deborah turned off the main road onto a narrower one, and then onto a path that was barely more than 2 tracks pressed into the snow. The trees grew close on either side. Ahead through the white branches, a wooden cabin appeared. It sat alone at the edge of the forest, solid and square, with a stone chimney that sent a thin thread of gray smoke up into the sky. A truck was parked to one side, dark green, old but maintained. And on the porch, standing with his arms loose at his sides, was a man. Nora looked at him the way she looked at everything. Carefully, without expression. Walt Briggs was 38 years old, though the lines around his eyes belonged to someone older. He stood just over 6 feet broad through the shoulders in the way that comes from years of real work and not from a gym. His hair was dark and cut short, grown out slightly at the temples. He had a beard that was neither neat nor neglected, simply there the way a man's beard is when he stops caring about appearances, but hasn't quite stopped caring about himself. His eyes were dark brown, steady and quiet, and they moved to the car the moment it turned off the road. Beside him, a dog sat at attention. The dog was large, a German shepherd 5 years old with a coat of deep black across his back and warm brown along his chest and legs. His ears stood perfectly upright, rotating slightly toward the sound of the approaching vehicle. His name was Duke, and there was something in the way he held himself, even in stillness, that suggested a creature trained for purpose and never quite able to forget it. He did not bark. He simply watched. Deborah stopped the car and stepped out. She spoke quietly to Walt, words Nora could not hear through the glass. Walt nodded once. He didn't smile. He was looking past Deborah, at the car, at the shape of the girl in the back seat. Nora unclipped her seatbelt and opened the door herself. The cold hit her immediately, dry and sharp, carrying the smell of pine and frozen earth. Her boots found the packed snow, and she stood pulling her backpack onto one shoulder. She was wearing a coat 2 sizes too large for her, dark olive green, the kind of coat that had been worn by someone else first. Someone larger. Someone who was no longer here to wear it. Walt looked at her. He opened his mouth and then for a moment closed it again. He was a man who had spent his adult life in the United States Navy, who had stood on the decks of ships in the middle of the Pacific Ocean during storms that made the world feel very small, who had learned to speak clearly and with authority in situations where clarity meant the difference between order and chaos. And yet, standing on the porch of his own cabin, looking at a 10-year-old girl in an oversized coat, he managed only this. "You hungry?" Nora looked at him. She said nothing. He nodded as if this were a reasonable answer. Duke came down the porch steps, then slowly, without urgency. He crossed the short distance between the porch and the girl with a measured, deliberate stride. 2 feet away, he stopped. His dark eyes were level and calm. Then, in a motion that was neither sudden nor commanded, the large dog lowered himself to the snow. He lay down at her feet, his chin extended forward, his tail moving in a single slow sweep. Nora looked down at the dog. Something crossed her face. Not a smile, not quite. But the measuring quality in her eyes shifted, became something else, something less defended. She crouched down slowly and placed one hand on the side of Duke's broad head. The dog didn't move. He simply accepted it as though this were the most natural thing in the world. Deborah, still standing by the car, exhaled quietly. Walt watched the two of them. He said nothing. That was the beginning. The first days at the cabin were not warm. They were not cold either in the way that cruelty is cold. They existed in a particular kind of in-between two people, and while occupying a shared space with the careful precision of people who do not yet know the rules of living together. Walt woke before sunrise as he had done every morning for most of his adult life. The habit was in his bones now, older than intention. He started the wood stove in the main room, filled the kettle, and moved through the small cabin in the dark without turning on the lights until it was necessary. He was a man who had learned to operate quietly, to take up only as much space as was needed. He made breakfast badly. This was not a metaphor. Walt Briggs could repair a diesel engine in deteriorating weather conditions, navigate by stars, and perform basic emergency medical care on a rolling deck. He could not scramble eggs without burning them on one side. He could not make toast without checking it 3 times. He stood at the small stove each morning with the focused concentration of a man diffusing something dangerous, and every morning produced results that were technically edible, but aesthetically unfortunate. Nora sat at the table and ate without comment. He tried on the second morning to ask if she wanted orange juice. He held up the carton and gestured toward her glass. She looked at him. She looked at the carton. She nodded barely perceptibly. He poured it. He sat down across from her. The silence between them had texture, had weight, but it was not hostile. It was simply the silence of two people who had not yet found the language for whatever this was. Duke lay between them on the wooden floor, his eyes moving from Walt to Nora and back again, like a man watching a conversation he could not hear, but understood perfectly well. Walt had known before Nora arrived the basics of what had happened. He had received a letter from a law office in Denver 3 weeks after it was sent, because he had not checked his post office box in 3 weeks. The letter was brief, professional. It told him that James Raymond Holt, known to his friends as Ray, had died. It gave a date. It said there was a daughter. It listed a contact number. He had gone to the Cedar Falls post office the next morning. Opal Carey stood behind the counter with the expression of someone who had already read the situation from the way he was walking. She was a woman in her early 50s with silver-streaked auburn hair and eyes that had spent 4 decades watching people come and go through that door. She had been postmaster of Cedar Falls long enough to know that the letters she handed out sometimes changed the shape of a person's life. She handled this knowledge with the quiet dignity it deserved. She set a second envelope on the counter beside the one from the law office. "This one came with it," she said. Walt opened it there at the counter because his hands were already moving before he made the decision to move them. Inside was a clipping from a Denver newspaper. The headline was small. The story was not long. A man had been driving on an overpass when the car ahead of him struck a guardrail and caught fire. The man had stopped his vehicle. He had pulled a child, a girl of 7, from the burning car before the gas tank ignited. The child survived. The man did not make it out before the second explosion. The man was identified as James Raymond Holt, 39, formerly of Cedar Falls, Montana. Walt read it twice. Opal Carey said nothing. She was a woman who understood when silence was the appropriate response. Walt folded the clipping and put it in his coat pocket, and he walked out of the post office into the winter air, and Duke fell into step beside him without being asked, and they walked all the way back to the cabin along the road without speaking, which was not unusual for either of them. What Walt did not know, what no one told him until much later, was that Nora had been in the car. Not the burning one, Ray's car. She had been sitting in the passenger seat when her father stopped, when he got out, when he ran toward the fire. She had watched through the windshield. She had watched him pull the other child out. She had watched what came after. She had been 10 years old and she had watched all of it. And then somewhere in the days that followed, in the quiet, sterile rooms of social services, in the careful, measured voices of counselors and caseworkers, She had simply stopped speaking. The doctor said there was nothing physiologically wrong. The counselors wrote words like selective mutism and acute grief response in their reports. But the truth, which only Nora fully understood, was simpler and harder than any of those words. She was not broken. She was furious. Her father had made a choice. On an overpass in Denver on a Tuesday afternoon with his daughter sitting 3 feet away, Ray Holt had chosen a stranger's child over staying. He had not thought about it. He had not hesitated. He had simply gone. And the child he left behind in the passenger seat, the child who had watched every second of it, had decided that if the world worked that way, then the world could manage without her voice for a while. Walt did not know this yet. He made his bad breakfast. He fixed fences around town. He drove Nora to the small Cedar Falls school twice before she made it clear through the particular quality of her stillness on the morning of the third attempt that she was not going back, and he did not know what the appropriate response to this was. So he drove back to the cabin and said nothing, and felt the weight of being profoundly unqualified for the task in front of him. Duke knew something Walt did not. On the fifth day after Nora's arrival, Walt came back from a repair job in town to find Duke sitting outside Nora's bedroom door. Not lying, sitting, upright attentive, as though holding a post. Walt had seen Duke maintain that posture on long operations in the dark for hours without moving. He had not expected to see it outside a child's bedroom in a Montana cabin. He knocked gently on the door. No answer. He opened it a few inches. Nora was sitting on the floor with her back against the bed, her knees pulled to her chest. She wasn't crying, she was looking at the wall. Duke pushed past Walt's leg and went directly to her, settling against her side with the practiced ease of an animal that has done this before. Walt pulled the door mostly closed. He went to the kitchen and put the kettle on and stood there with his hands on the counter for a while. On the seventh day, he found the coat. He had not intended to find it. He was looking for a spare wool blanket in the closet near the front door, and when he opened the closet door, the olive coat was hanging there, and the smell of it reached him before he could stop it. Cedar and something faintly chemical machine oil, or something like it, and under that something else entirely, the specific human presence of a person who no longer existed. Ray had owned a coat like this. Walt recognized the make, the cut, the particular wear pattern on the collar. It was Ray's coat. Nora had been wearing it every day. That afternoon, Nora came out of her room in the coat. Duke was lying near the wood stove, dozing in the warmth. The moment Nora stepped into the main room, something changed in the dog. It happened in less than a second. His head came up. His nose worked. His ears, which had been relaxed, rose to their full height. He got to his feet in a single fluid motion, and he stood very still, staring at Nora with an intensity that was different from anything Walt had seen from him before. Not protective, not alert to danger, searching. Duke crossed the room slowly and pressed his nose to the front of the coat. Then he stood back. His tail moved once slowly from side to side. Walt had seen Duke track scents over distances of hundreds of meters in training operations. He had seen the dog identify individuals by smell in conditions that made visual identification impossible. He knew with the certainty of someone who had worked alongside this animal for 3 years that Duke was not confused about what he was smelling. He was not confusing Nora for Ray. He knew exactly who Ray was. It came back to Walt, then something he had nearly forgotten. 2 years ago, during a brief leave before his final deployment, Walt had driven up to Cedar Falls with Duke. He had spent 3 days at Ray's house in town. Ray had a small house then, before things had changed before the move to Denver. Duke had slept on Ray's porch. He had eaten from a bowl Ray put out. He had walked the yard with Ray in the evenings, while Walt sat on the steps, and they talked the way old friends talk when time is short, and they both know it. Duke had known Ray, and now with the irreplaceable loyalty of a working dog who does not forget the people it has learned to trust, Duke was looking at the coat on this small girl's shoulders and finding in it the last remaining trace of a man he had once been close enough to touch. Nora looked at Walt. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The expression on her face was not a question. It was something quieter, an acknowledgement, as though she and the dog had arrived at an understanding that existed below language. Walt nodded slowly. He was a good man, he said. It was the first time he had spoken Ray's name out loud since reading the newspaper clipping. Nora looked at him for a moment. Then she looked back at Duke. She reached down and placed her hand on the dog's head, and Duke leaned into it, and that was that. The third week of January moved through Cedar Falls with the unhurried certainty of deep winter. Days were short and dark at the edges. The wood stove worked constantly. Walt kept up his repair jobs around town, and Nora kept up her arrangement with silence, and Duke kept up his role as the single bridge between the two of them, sitting at Walt's feet in the evenings and sleeping outside Nora's door at night, as though he had been assigned to this duty by some authority neither of them could name. Walt learned small things. He learned that Nora ate oatmeal without complaint, but left eggs untouched if they were scrambled. He learned that she preferred to sit by the window that faced the forest rather than the one that faced the road. He learned that she had a small notebook in her backpack, dark blue cover, and that she drew in it sometimes sitting at the table after dinner with a pencil moving across the page in quick, precise strokes. He never asked to see what she drew. She never offered. He learned that she watched him work. When he was repairing something in or around the cabin, replacing a hinge on the back door, recaulking around the window frame, splitting firewood in the side yard, he would become aware at some point that she was there. Not close, not speaking, just present. Standing on the porch or sitting on a fence post at a distance, watching with the same measuring attention she gave everything else. He did not comment on this. It seemed to him that presence offered without demand was something she understood better than words. Duke escorted her everywhere. When she walked to the tree line and back, Duke walked at her left side. When she sat on the porch steps, Duke lay across the bottom step. The dog had appointed himself to a role and was executing it with the seriousness of long experience. On the afternoon that everything changed for the first time, the sky had cleared. It was rare, that kind of clarity, in late January in the valley. The clouds pulled back from the mountains, and the sunlight came through sharp and brilliant, turning the snow into something almost painful to look at. The temperature was still well below freezing, but there was something in the air that felt different, eliciting a brief suggestion of possibility. Nora came out of the cabin in Ray's coat and her boots and a gray wool hat that was slightly too large and sat low over her forehead. She stood on the porch steps for a moment, looking out. Duke appeared at her side from around the corner of the cabin and fell into his position at her left. Walt was around the side of the cabin, replacing two boards on the exterior wall that had rotted through over the summer. He could see Nora from where he worked. He watched her step down into the snow and begin walking slowly toward the tree line at the back of the property, Duke moving exactly in pace beside her. He returned to his work. 10 minutes passed, maybe 15. Then Duke barked. Walt had worked alongside Duke long enough to know the full vocabulary of the dog's voice. There was the low single bark of acknowledgement. There was the rapid escalating bark of alarm. There was the sharp carrying bark of summons, the one that meant come here now and was different from all the others in a way that was impossible to misidentify. This was the third kind. Walt dropped the pry bar and came around the corner of the cabin at a run. Duke was barking from somewhere in the trees, not far and maybe 40 yards from the cabin. Walt crossed the yard in a few seconds and pushed through the first line of branches. The snow here was disturbed Nora's boot prints going in, and then a disruption in the pattern, the prints ending suddenly at a low depression in the ground that the snow had concealed. The earth here between the roots of two large pines had collapsed slightly over years, creating a narrow channel about 6 feet deep with steep, packed dirt walls. Nora was at the bottom. She was standing not injured, her arms out slightly to her sides for balance. She had tried to climb out once the scrape marks were visible on one wall and had not managed it. She was looking up with an expression that was frightened and controlled, at the same time the expression of someone who has assessed the situation and is waiting for useful input. Duke stood at the edge, going still when Walt arrived. "You okay?" Walt said. She looked at him. The expression said, "I'm standing at the bottom of a hole. What do you think?" He almost smiled. Almost. The pit was too narrow for him to climb down safely. His weight on the loose walls would likely cause them to give, making things worse. He lay flat on his stomach at the edge and reached down as far as he could. The distance was still too great. Duke moved. The dog stepped to the edge, looked down at Nora, and then, with the careful deliberateness of an animal that understands what is needed, lowered himself partway down the sloped edge of the pit, bracing his hind legs against the firmer earth at the rim, while his body angled down along the wall. He held himself there completely still, a large and powerful anchor positioned between the bottom of the pit and the top. Nora looked at Duke. She looked up at Walt. "Hold on to him," Walt said. "And climb." She reached up and wrapped both arms around Duke's midsection, and Duke did not move, did not flinch, held his position with the focused immobility of a trained animal, executing a task it understands completely. Nora worked her feet up the wall using Duke's body for leverage, and Walt reached down and caught her forearms when she was close enough, and with one long pull, he lifted her up onto solid ground. She stood in the snow, breathing hard. Her coat was dirty. Her hat had come off somewhere in the pit. She was not hurt. Duke climbed out beside her, shook the snow from his coat, and sat down. Nora stood very still for a moment. Walt started to brush snow off the back of her coat the way an older person does when something frightening has just passed and the hands need something to do. He was about to say something practical and insufficient about watching where she walked near the tree line when she spoke. Her voice was quiet, barely a voice at all. It was aimed at no particular person. Her eyes were looking out past the trees, past the edge of the property, past the valley, at something that existed in a direction that couldn't be marked on any map. "I'm okay, Deb." 3 words. Walt's hand stilled on her shoulder. He straightened. He turned slightly, not fully away, but enough. He looked at the trees. He cleared his throat once quietly and kept his face turned toward the middle distance until he was certain his expression had settled back into something appropriate. Duke stepped forward and pressed his flank gently against Nora's side. The 3 of them stood in the snow in the cold January light for a moment. The forest was completely still. No wind, no sound from the road. The smoke from the cabin chimney rose straight up into the pale sky. Then Walt bent down and picked up her hat from where it had fallen. He held it out to her. She took it, put it back on, pulled it down low over her ears. They walked back to the cabin together, the girl in the middle, the dog at her left side, the man a step behind them. Walt made lunch. He burned one edge of the grilled cheese and cut off that part before putting it on her plate. She sat at the table by the window and ate it without comment. Duke lay on the floor between them. The silence between them was still present in all the ways it had been before. But it had changed in the way that a door changes when someone has pressed their hand against it from the other side. Not open, not even unlocked, but no longer quite the same door as before. Outside the cabin, the winter light moved across the valley toward evening, long and pale, and without hurry. The mountains at the edge of the world stood exactly where they had always been. The smoke from the chimney drifted and disappeared. Somewhere under the snow, in a forest neither of them had yet entered, something waited to be found. February came to Cedar Falls the way it always did, without apology and without warmth. The cold deepened for a week and then eased slightly, and the snow on the ground settled and compressed into something harder and more permanent, the kind that would stay until March at least. The pine trees along the ridge held their snow in thick clumps on the upper branches, and in the early morning the whole valley had a quality of held breath, as though the land itself was waiting for something it could not name. Inside the cabin, small things had shifted. Nora still did not speak in the way that people ordinarily speak, in complete sentences in response to questions in the natural back and forth of daily life. But she had begun to communicate in other ways that Walt was learning to read, the way a man learns to read weather, by paying attention and making no sudden movements. She would tap the table twice when she wanted more coffee in her cup, though the coffee was mostly milk and sugar, a ratio Walt had discovered by trial and error over 10 days. She would stand near the door in a particular way when she wanted to go outside. She would bring her notebook to the table and open it to a blank page when she had energy she didn't know what to do with. He had learned not to look at the notebook unless she turned it toward him. She had turned it toward him once. A drawing of Duke done with the kind of accuracy that surprised him, the exact set of the ears, the particular angle of the head. She had pushed it across the table and looked at him and then looked away. He had studied it for a moment and said, "That's him, exactly." She had retrieved the notebook without expression, but something in the set of her shoulders had changed very slightly, in the way that small acknowledgments land when a person has been waiting for one. Twice in the second week of February, Walt had woken in the early hours to the sound of Nora moving in her room. Not distress sounds, just movement, the particular restlessness of a child who cannot sleep and is trying to manage it quietly. Both times he had gotten up and gone to the kitchen and started the kettle and waited. Both times Nora had appeared at her doorway within a few minutes, Duke at her side, and sat at the table. He had put warm milk in front of her and sat across from her, and they had occupied the small kitchen in the middle of the night without speaking, while the stove ticked and the wind moved outside, and the mountains stood at the edge of the dark. He did not know if this was helping her. What he knew was that Ray Holt had written the words, "The man who always kept his word," in a legal document in Denver without qualification, and that this was the work in front of him, and he intended to do it regardless of whether he felt equipped for it. On a Thursday morning in the third week of February, the sky cleared again. Nora was on the porch when Walt came around the side of the cabin from checking the woodpile. She was standing at the top of the steps, not sitting, and Duke was not in his usual position at her side. Walt scanned the yard automatically, the trained habit of someone accustomed to tracking the location of things that matter. Duke was at the edge of the property near the line where the maintained yard gave way to the deeper forest. He was standing very still, his nose working his ears, oriented forward into the trees. Then he turned his head and looked directly at Walt. Walt stopped. Duke looked back at the forest, then at Walt again. Then he took 3 deliberate steps into the trees and stopped and turned once more. This was not exploration. Walt had seen Duke explore. This was a specific, deliberate communication from an animal trained to use exactly this behavior to indicate a find. He looked at Nora. She was already watching Duke, and as Walt looked at her, she stepped down off the porch and began walking toward the dog. Not running, not hesitating, walking with the particular certainty of someone who has already made a decision. Walt followed. The forest behind the cabin was older than the town. The pine trunks were wide at the base, and the canopy closed overhead into a gray-green lattice that filtered the winter light into something thin and diffused. The ground was uneven with roots and the compressed remains of decades of fallen needles beneath the snow. Duke moved through the trees with direction and intention, pausing every 20 or 30 yards to verify that they were still behind him. Nora walked with her hands pushed into the pockets of Ray's coat. She did not look frightened or uncertain. She looked like someone following a thread she could feel but not quite see. They walked for nearly 10 minutes, long enough that the cabin had disappeared behind them and the sounds of the road had faded entirely. The forest thinned slightly as the ground leveled off, and then they came through a gap between 2 large pines and into an open space that stopped Walt mid-step. It was a clearing roughly rectangular, perhaps half an acre. The snow lay undisturbed across it, except for the tracks of small animals near the edges. The grass beneath was tall and dead and pressed flat by the weight of winter. Around the perimeter, the collapsed remains of a wooden fence lay half buried in the earth, the boards gray and splintered and reclaimed by decades of weather. Where a structure had once stood at the far end of the clearing, only the lowest courses of foundation logs remained dark with age and moisture. A large flat stone sat near the center of the open ground, wide enough for a person to sit comfortably. Duke walked directly to the stone and stopped. He looked at Walt. Then he began to dig. His front paws worked at the snow and frozen earth at the base of the stone with efficient, practiced motion. Snow scattered behind him, then soil. Then, with a hollow sound that was distinctly different from the sound of earth, his paw struck something hard. Walt crouched down. He brushed aside the remaining soil with his gloved hand, and what he uncovered was a metal box approximately the size of a shoebox, old and thoroughly rusted at the seams, but still sealed. The latch had corroded but yielded when Walt worked it carefully. He opened the lid. Inside, several folded envelopes and a stack of papers wrapped in a piece of oilcloth that had preserved them from the moisture. And on top of everything else, face up, a photograph. Walt picked up the photograph and looked at it. It showed a small child sitting on the flat stone behind him. The child was perhaps 3 years old, with dark hair and pale skin and gray-blue eyes aimed directly at the camera with an expression of complete unselfconscious curiosity. She was wearing a red coat too big for her small frame. Her hands were flat on the stone on either side of her legs. She looked entirely at home. Walt turned to Nora. Nora was standing 2 feet away, looking at the photograph in his hands. Her expression did not change immediately. She reached out and took the photograph, carefully holding it with both hands, and looked at it for a long time. Walt watched her face. He watched the precise moment when the held-back quality of her expression began to give way slowly, like ice under a sun that has been patient for a very long time. Her chin moved first, then her eyes changed, filling with something that was not quite tears yet, but was everything that comes before them. She had not cried once since arriving at the cabin. Not once in the 3 weeks before that, according to Deborah's notes. Not at the funeral, not in the sterile offices of social services, not in the backseat of any of the cars that had moved her from one place to the next. The sound that came from her was small and broken and real, the kind of sound a person makes when they have been holding something for so long that the muscles giving way is almost a relief. Walt did not move toward her. He did not speak. He simply stayed where he was, close enough to matter far enough to give her the space that grief requires. Duke pressed himself gently against her side. She cried for perhaps 2 minutes. Then she stopped the way children stop completely and without the gradual diminishment that adults take. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. She looked at the photograph once more. Then she set it carefully on top of the box and looked at Walt with eyes that were red and clear and different from the eyes she had been wearing since she arrived. Walt handed her the first envelope from the stack. He did not open it himself. He did not read it first. He held it out to her because it had been placed there by her father in this ground on a stone where her 3-year-old self had once sat, and whatever it contained belonged to her before it belonged to anyone. She took it. She unfolded it carefully. The paper was aged, but the ink was legible, and she read slowly, her lips moving slightly on the longer words. Rahul had written about a place, about a dream he had carried since childhood, since the years when his parents had worked this land and he had grown up in the clearing that Walt and Nora were now standing in. He wrote about wanting to come back. He wrote about wanting to build something here that had a purpose, a shelter for animals that had no one to speak for them, working dogs that had been decommissioned and had nowhere to go, strays that had wandered too far, injured wildlife that needed time before they could return to the world. He wrote that animals were like soldiers sometimes. They did not always choose their battles, but they kept trying anyway. Nora read this part twice. At the bottom of the letter, in the slightly different ink of a different pen, as though he had come back to add it later, Ray had written a final paragraph. He wrote that if she was reading this, if she had found her way back to this place, then she was old enough to understand that he had tried, that he had wanted to build something worth leaving behind, that he had not managed to do it alone, and that he hoped wherever this letter found her, she was not entirely alone either. Nora folded the letter. She held it in both hands for a moment, looking at the clearing. Then she reached into the box and removed the papers wrapped in oilcloth. She unfolded them on top of the box, smoothing them flat with her palms. They were drawings, precise and detailed drawings of a property layout, showing the clearing, the placement of structures, fencing plans, and water access. The kind of drawings a person makes when they have thought about something for a long time and finally committed it to paper. Nora studied them quietly and completely. Then she looked up and around the clearing, orienting the drawing against the actual landscape, matching lines on paper to the shapes of the real world in front of her. Walt watched her do this. He felt something move in his chest that he did not immediately have a name for. She looked at him. She tapped the drawings with one finger. She gestured at the clearing. "I know," he said. "I see it." She reached into Ray's coat and produced the short pencil she kept in the inside pocket and made a small mark on one of the drawings where the main structure had been indicated. She turned the paper toward Walt and pointed at the mark, then pointed at the foundation logs at the far end of the clearing. He looked at the drawing, he looked at the mugs, he looked back at her. "Yeah," he said, "that's where it starts." As she put the pencil back and began returning the drawings to the oilcloth, something shifted at the bottom of the stack. A folded piece of paper smaller than the others tucked beneath everything else. On the outside in Ray's handwriting was a name. Walt's name. Nora saw it at the same moment he did. She picked it up and held it for a moment, turning it over once in her hands, and then she looked at Walt and placed it carefully back beneath the drawings. She closed the oilcloth around the stack and returned everything to the box. Walt understood without her saying a word that she was not ready to give it to him yet. Not here, not now. She was saving it for the right moment, the way a person saves the last line of a letter they already know will matter. He picked up the photograph from where she had set it on the stone and put it carefully inside his jacket against his chest. Then he followed her out of the clearing. 3 days later, Opal Carey met Walt at the post office door before he could reach the counter. She had an envelope in her hand, and her expression had the particular quality it wore when she was about to tell someone something they needed to know but would not be glad to hear. She had perfected this expression over 4 decades of working a post office counter in a small town. It was not unkind, it was simply honest. The envelope was from the county planning office. Walt read it standing at the counter. The language was administrative and without drama, which made the content no less clear. A development company based in Billings had filed a formal request to acquire the parcel of land known as the former Holt property, citing continuous abandonment with no resident claimant. Under Montana state law, the county had 90 days to identify a legitimate heir or custodian before the acquisition process could proceed. The clock had been running for 32 days already. 58 days remain. Walt folded the letter. He looked at Opal. "Did you know about this?" he said. She pressed her lips together. "I knew Cormac Dolan had been dealing with something involving that land. He didn't say specifically, but I've known Cormac for 40 years. She paused. "He came in this morning, actually, asked if you'd been in recently." Walt drove directly from the post office to the south end of Cedar Falls, where Cormac Dolan had operated his carpentry business out of the same building for 38 years. The building was a large workshop attached to a modest house, both as well-maintained as everything Cormac built, which was to say, very well-maintained. A truck sat in the driveway, old and wide, and loaded in the bed with lumber that had not yet been unloaded. Cormac Dolan was 61 years old. He was a large man, not tall but broad-built, close to the ground in the way of men who have done physical work their entire lives and carry the center of gravity to show for it. His hair was fully gray and cut short, and his beard was the same, and his hands were the kind of hands that made everything he touched with them seem sturdier for the contact. He had the direct, unhurried manner of someone who has spent most of his life building things that are meant to last. He came out of the workshop when he heard Walt's truck and stood in the driveway with his arms at his sides, waiting. Walt got out. He held up the letter from the county. Cormac looked at it. He nodded slowly, unsurprised. "Come inside," he said. The workshop smelled of sawdust, and linseed oil and cold air led in through the open bay. Cormac poured 2 cups of coffee from a pot on a small table near the back and handed one to Walt, and sat on a workbench and looked at the floor for a moment before he spoke. He had known about the acquisition filing for 35 days. He had retained a lawyer in Bozeman at his own expense and instructed him to file an objection. The objection had been rejected on the grounds that Cormac had no legal standing in the matter. He was not a family member. He was not a designated custodian. He was, in the eyes of the county, simply a neighbor. What he was, in fact, was the man who had been coming to the Holt property every autumn for 30 years to clear the perimeter brush, restake the fence markers, and ensure that no one quietly absorbed the edges of the land into adjacent parcels. He had done this without being asked, without compensation, and without telling anyone, because his father and Ray's father had been the closest of friends, and when the Holt family had come apart and the land had been left empty, Cormac had made a private decision that he would keep faith with that land until someone from the family came back to claim it. "I didn't know if it would be Ray," he said, "or someone after Ray. I just knew it would be someone." He looked at Walt. "When I heard you'd brought the girl here, I went out there, to the clearing." He paused. Someone had been digging near the center stone. Walt said nothing. "Ray's daddy built the first 3 barns in this valley," Cormac said. "He was the best man I've ever known after my own father. That land doesn't belong to a company in Billings." He set down his coffee. "What do you need?" Walt looked at him for a long moment. "I need to know if the timber in that truck is spoken for." Cormac looked at the truck through the open bay door. "It wasn't," he said, "until about 30 seconds ago." He picked up his coffee and looked at Walt with the steady, undemonstrative expression of a man who has been waiting a long time for someone to ask the right question. The following afternoon, Cormac's truck rolled into the clearing for the first time. Nora was there when it arrived. She had been there for most of the morning, standing in different parts of the clearing, with Ray's drawings unfolded in her hands, looking from the paper to the land and back again with the systematic focus of someone conducting an assessment. Duke moved with her, stopping when she stopped waiting when she waited. Walt had driven out earlier to begin clearing the collapsed fence material from the perimeter, hauling the rotted boards to a pile at the edge of the tree line. When Cormac's truck came through the gap in the trees and stopped at the clearing's edge, Nora turned to look at it. She watched Cormac climb out. She watched him survey the space with the experienced eye of a man who builds things for a living, taking in the foundation logs, the dimensions of the clearing, the angle of the ground. Then she walked to him. She had the drawings in her hands. She unfolded them and held them out, and she pointed at the indicated position of the main structure, and then at the foundation logs, and then back at the drawing. She turned the paper to show him the dimensions Ray had noted. Cormac looked at the drawings for a long time. He looked at the land. He crouched down to examine the foundation logs, pressing his thumb against the wood, testing the integrity of what remained. He stood back up. "These drawings are good," he said. "Whoever did them knew what they were doing." He looked at Nora. She looked back at him with the steady, evaluating attention she gave to everything, the attention of a child who has learned that most adults will tell you less than they know if given the choice. "Your grandfather built in this valley," Cormac said. "I helped him once when I was about your age. His hands knew how to do it right." He paused. "Looks like his son thought about it the same way." Nora looked at the drawings. She made a small mark with her pencil, indicating the first section of fencing that would need to go up before anything else. She pointed at it. She pointed at the lumber in the truck. Cormac studied the mark. He looked at Walt, who was standing nearby watching all of this. Walt shrugged slightly. "She's running the build," he said. Cormac looked back at Nora. Something in his expression shifted, a loosening around the eyes, not quite a smile, but the thing that comes just before one. "All right," he said. He pulled work gloves from his back pocket. "Show me where you want to start." The first fence post went into the ground that afternoon. Walt dug the holes and Cormac set the posts and tamped them level, and Nora stood at the corner of the property with the drawings and watched and pointed when something needed adjusting, and Duke patrolled the clearing perimeter in long, measured circuits, as though he had been assigned to keep the boundary of the work. 4 days later, on a gray mid-morning, a vehicle Walt did not recognize pulled up to the edge of the clearing. It was a clean white truck, unmarked, and the man who stepped out of it wore a pressed jacket and carried a clipboard. He was perhaps 40, with the manner of someone accustomed to delivering unwelcome information in a tone designed to make resistance seem unreasonable. He looked around the clearing with the particular expression of a person calculating what things are worth rather than what they mean. His name was Garrett, he said. He represented the development company that had filed the acquisition claim. He had driven up from Billings to conduct a preliminary site assessment. Walt set down his tools and walked toward him. Garrett consulted his clipboard. The acquisition filing was proceeding through the appropriate channels, he explained. The property had been assessed as abandoned. He understood there were some individuals present on the land, but absent verified legal standing. Their presence constituted trespass on what would shortly become private property. He was prepared to be reasonable about a vacate timeline. Then he looked at Duke. He looked at the dog the way he had looked at the clearing, with the calculating attention of someone adding things up. He said that he had done some research before driving up. The German Shepherd, he had determined, matched the registration of a military working dog that had been formally decommissioned 18 months earlier. Decommissioned working dogs remained the property of the United States government unless a formal adoption had been completed through the appropriate federal program. He had checked. No such adoption appeared in the records. He was going to need to report the dog's location to the relevant federal office, he said. They would arrange retrieval. Walt went very still. Garrett was still talking something about procedures and timelines when Nora stepped forward. She had been standing at the far edge of the clearing with the drawings in her hands, close enough to hear everything. Now she walked across the frozen ground and placed herself between Garrett and Duke, with the directness of someone who has already decided that this is where she stands. Garrett looked down at her. He seemed mildly surprised that a child was addressing him. Nora looked up at him. Her voice, when it came, was not loud. It did not need to be. It was clear in the way that a single bell is clear, the way something is clear when it has been compressed under enormous pressure and finally released. "He's not property," she said. "He's the only reason I'm still talking." The clearing went quiet. Cormac, standing 20 feet away with a fence post in both hands, did not move. Walt stood where he was, his jaw set, his eyes on Garrett. Duke sat calmly at Nora's side, his ears upright, his gaze steady. Garrett looked at the girl. He looked at the dung. He looked at Walt, whose expression communicated without any words at all that he was not going to be moved from this ground, regardless of what the clipboard said. Garrett clicked his pen closed. He looked around the clearing, one more time at the fence posts, going in, at the foundation logs, at the small figure standing in front of the German Shepherd, with Ray's coat hanging to her knees and her chin level. He said he would be in touch with the office. He walked back to his truck. He drove away. Walt let out a slow breath. Cormac set the fence post down deliberately and looked at Nora. Then he looked at Walt. Then he picked the post back up and went back to work because there was nothing else to say, and there was still a fence to build. That evening, driving back to the cabin in the last of the daylight, Walt glanced over at Nora in the passenger seat. Duke was in the back, his chin resting on the center console between them. Nora was looking out the window at the mountains. Walt said, "You didn't have to do that." She kept looking at the mountains. "Yes, I did," she said. He nodded and drove, and the mountains held their shape against the darkening sky, and that was enough. Toward the end of the afternoon of the following day, with the light going low and orange in the pine tops, Duke disappeared into the trees at the east edge of the clearing. He was gone for perhaps 5 minutes. When he came back, something was moving behind him. It was a ding. Small, a mixed breed, perhaps a year old, with a tan and white coat that was thin and rough at the edges. One ear sat forward at an odd angle that gave it a permanent expression of uncertain attention. Its ribs were visible beneath the coat. It stopped at the tree line and watched the clearing with enormous, cautious eyes. Duke sat down in the grass 10 feet from it, making himself smaller, making no sound, simply waiting. Nora had been watching from across the clearing. She walked toward the small dog, slowly angling her approach so as not to come straight at it. She crouched down when she was still several feet away and held out one hand palm down. The small dog looked at her hand. It looked at Duke. It took 2 steps forward and stopped. Walt went to the truck and found the half-empty bag of kibble he kept behind the passenger seat. He brought a handful to Nora without being asked. She placed a small amount on the ground between her hand and the stray. The dog crept forward and ate. It looked up at Nora. It ate again. Nora looked at Walt. "Scout," she said. Her voice was barely a voice rough from weeks of disuse, but the word was clear. Clear enough that Cormac, standing 20 feet away with a fence post in his hands, went very still and looked at the ground for a moment before looking back up. Walt kept his expression even. "Scout," he agreed. Duke's tail moved slowly back and forth in the dead grass. Scout finished the kibble and took one more step forward until he was close enough to touch. Nora placed one hand gently on his rough coat, and the dog stood still and let her. The sun dropped behind the pines. The clearing went into blue shadow. The first completed section of fence stood straight and solid at the north edge of the property, a small start against the size of what had to be done, but a start in the way that the first word after a long silence is a start, carrying more weight than its size suggests. Walt pulled his collar up against the cold and went to help Cormac load the tools back into the truck before dark. March came to Cedar Falls the way spring always comes to mountain valleys. Not all at once, but in small and provisional installments. A day of warmth followed by 3 of cold. Snow melting at the edges of the road, only to freeze again overnight into ridges of dirty ice. The light changing in quality before it changed in quantity, becoming less gray, more white, carrying in it the suggestion of something longer and easier on the other side of the season. The whole property was no longer quiet. On most mornings by 7 o'clock, Cormac Dolan's truck was parked at the edge of the clearing, and the sound of his work carried through the trees to the road. He had recruited 2 men from town, brothers, named Aldrich and Pete Voss, both in their 50s, both semi-retired from a construction business they had sold the previous year, and both deeply bored with retirement. They showed up each morning with their own tools and worked without complaint and took direction from Cormac, and when Cormac indicated it with a nod in her direction from Nora. This had happened gradually and then all at once, the way most things in small towns happen. Opal Carey had put raised drawings up on the board at the post office, copies Walt had made at the library in town. People had come in and looked at them the way people look at something they recognize but cannot immediately place, and then one by one they had placed it. The Holt family, the clearing in the woods, the old days. The name on the land that had been there before half of Cedar Falls had been there. Ruth Maynard from the diner had sent over 2 cases of canned dog food and a 50-pound bag of dry kibble. No note attached, none needed. The hardware store had quietly set aside a quantity of roofing materials with Walt's name on the ticket and no price written next to it. A retired veterinarian named Dr. Lowell Marsh, who had moved to Cedar Falls from Billings 4 years ago and spent most of his retirement fishing, had driven out to the clearing one afternoon, examined each dog in residence with practiced hands, and then gone home and come back the next day with a truck bed full of medical supplies and a folding examination table. Walt had not asked for any of this. Neither had Nora. What had happened was simpler and older than organized generosity. It was the way small communities move when something true is happening in their midst, When the work being done is recognizable as the right kind of work, the kind that doesn't require explanation. People came because the thing being built in that clearing made sense to them in a way that most things did not, and because the Holt name meant something in Cedar Falls that could not be calculated in any ordinary ledger. On the third Tuesday of March, Walt drove to Denver. He had made the appointment 2 weeks earlier through a paralegal at the law office that had sent him the original letter about Ray. The office was on the 7th floor of a building downtown, clean and impersonal, in the way of places that handle other people's grief at a professional remove. The lawyer was a woman named Sandra Veal, practical and thorough, and not unkind, and she had Ray's complete file in front of her when Walt sat down. She walked him through it. Ray's estate was modest. The Denver apartment had been rented. There was a small savings account and a truck that had been totaled in the accident. The only real asset of any significance was the land in Cedar Falls, which Ray had inherited from his parents and never sold and never developed and never stopped paying the annual property taxes on, even in the years when the payments had been difficult. The estate documents listed Nora Holt as sole heir. In the section designated for guardian, Ray had written in his own hand, "The man who always kept his word." Below this, he had affixed a photograph printed on plain paper, slightly blurry at the edges, but clear enough. It showed two men on the deck of a ship somewhere at sea, the water behind them gray, and the sky above them gray, and both of them squinting slightly into a wind coming from off-frame. They were young in the photograph, mid-20s. One of them was Ray, the other one was Walt. Sandra Veal looked at Walt across the desk. "There's no ambiguity in the document," she said. "The designation is clear." She slid a form across the desk. "The company that filed the acquisition claim has already been notified that a legitimate heir and designated guardian have been identified. They withdrew their filing yesterday." Walt looked at the form. He looked at the photograph. He picked up the pen she had placed beside the form and signed his name where the tab indicated. He drove back to Cedar Falls the same day, 9 hours through the dark and then through the early morning light that came over the mountains east of the valley. He stopped once for fuel and coffee and stood beside the truck in the coating with the cup warming his hands, and looked at the stars above the highway, more of them visible out here than anywhere else he had lived. Ray had known. That was the thing Walt kept returning to on the long drive. Not hoped, not assumed. Known. Had written the man who always kept his word with the unhesitating certainty of someone describing a fact. Had filed it with a lawyer. Had affixed the photograph. Walt thought about the ship, the deck, the wind, Ray's voice saying things that had seemed at the time like ordinary conversation. He thought about how ordinary conversation was, sometimes the most serious kind. He was back in Cedar Falls before Nora woke up. The last week of March brought 4 consecutive days of real warmth, the first of the season, and the clearing on the Holt property transformed in those 4 days in ways that weeks of cold work had been building toward. The main shelter was complete, a long, low structure of pine and corrugated metal roofing that sat on the original foundation logs in the position Ray's drawings had indicated, solid and practical, and built with Cormac's characteristic attention to what would last. 6 separate runs extended from it, fenced and covered, each large enough for 2 dogs to move freely. A water system ran from a nearby creek via a simple gravity feed that the Voss brothers had engineered over the course of a week with a great deal of argument between themselves and ultimately a workable solution. The sign was the last thing. Cormac had been working on it in his workshop for 2 weeks. He brought it out on a Saturday morning wrapped in canvas, and he and Walt mounted it on 2 posts at the entrance to the clearing where the path through the trees opened onto the property. When they pulled the canvas off, the letters were carved deep and clean into a wide plank of Douglas fir that Cormac had cured himself and finished with an oil that would hold for 20 years in Montana weather. Holt Animal Haven. Nora stood in front of it for a long time. Duke sat beside her, Scout sat on her other side, and a third dog, a large gray-muzzled older hound they had found sheltering under the foundation logs of an abandoned barn outside town 2 weeks ago, sat behind them both with the patient authority of a creature who has seen enough of the world to know when something good is happening. Walt stood back and watched her look at the sign. He was aware, in the way he had become aware of many things over the past 2 months, that this moment did not belong to him. He was here, and his presence mattered in the specific way that the presence of a reliable person always matters, as structure, as continuity, as proof that the ground will hold. But the clearing and the sign and everything they represented belonged to the girl standing in front of them and to the man who had dreamed them from a long way off and had not lived to see them built. Cormac came to stand beside Walt. He looked at the sign and then at the girl and then at the mountains beyond the tree line. His daddy would have liked this, Cormac said finally. Walt nodded. Ray, too. Cormac put his hands in his pockets. He used to come out to this clearing when he was a kid. After his folks were gone and the place was empty, he still came sometimes, just to sit on that stone. He paused. I used to see his truck parked on the road when I was driving past. Never stopped. Figured a man deserves his private places. Walt looked at the flat stone near the center of the clearing. Duke had left Nora's side and was lying on it now, stretched in the March sunlight, with the contentment of an animal that has arrived somewhere it intends to stay. The gathering that afternoon had not been formally organized because formal organization was not the way Cedar Falls worked. People came because Opal Carey had mentioned the sign going up to 4 people on Thursday, and those 4 had mentioned it to others, and by early afternoon there were perhaps 30 people standing at the edge of the clearing or sitting on sections of log that someone had thoughtfully arranged at the perimeter. Ruth Maynard from the diner had brought a large thermos of coffee and a tray of something that smelled of cinnamon. The Voss brothers were there with their wives. Dr. Marsh stood near the shelter runs, watching the dogs move in and out with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has contributed something and knows it. Walt stood to one side and watched Cedar Falls occupy the clearing that had been empty for so long, and felt something that was neither pride nor relief but contained elements of both and was quieter than either. Nora came to him. She had been moving through the gathered people with Duke beside her, and he had watched how people responded to her, the particular quality of attention adults give to children who are carrying something larger than childhood. She stopped in front of him. She was holding something in her hands. It was the last piece of paper from the metal box, the one folded in quarters with Walt's name written on the outside in Ray's handwriting. She had been holding on to it since the clearing, waiting with the instinct of someone who understood that certain thing needed to be given at the right moment in the right place. This was the moment. This was the place. She held it out to him. Walt looked at it. He looked at her face. She nodded once and held it out further. He took it. He unfolded it slowly. The paper was the same aged quality as the others written in the same hand, but the tone of it was different from the letters to Nora. It was simpler, shorter. The way Ray talked when he was being most serious, without decoration, without any of the easy warmth he used with everyone else. It said, Walt, if you're reading this, you came. I always knew you would, but I wrote it down anyway because you deserve to hear it in real words. You were the most decent person I ever knew. Not the loudest, not the one with the most to say, just the most steady. The kind of steady that matters when everything else isn't. I left you the hardest thing I could think of, which is proof that I trusted you more than anyone. Take care of my girl. I don't think I need to say it twice. And if you're standing somewhere in Montana when you read this, go outside and look at the mountains. That was always my favorite part of telling you about this place. The look on your face when you tried to imagine it. I hope it's better than you imagined. It probably is. Walt stopped reading. He stood with the paper in his hands and looked at the mountains at the edge of the valley. They were fully visible in the afternoon light, the last of the winter snow still on the upper ridges, the lower slopes turning the first faint green of early spring. The sky above them was the pale blue of a day that has decided to be warm. He had not cried since the morning he read the newspaper clipping in the post office, not at the funeral which he had driven to Denver for and stood at the back of and left before it ended. Not on the long nights in the weapon or on the drive back from Denver or on any of the mornings that he had stood in front of the wood stove and felt the specific weight of what his friend's death had removed from the world. He stood in the clearing with the paper in his hands and let it happen quietly, looking at the mountains, and Nora stood beside him and looked at the mountains too, and neither of them spoke for a while. Duke came off the flat stone and walked to them and sat down between them with the calm of a creature that understands exactly where it is supposed to be. After a while, Nora said, "He said we'd find each other." Her voice was still not the easy, unguarded voice of a child who has never been hurt. It probably would not be that voice for some time, and perhaps it would never be entirely that voice because some things that happen to people leave their shape inside the voice permanently. But it was her voice, clear and real and belonging entirely to her. Walt folded the paper carefully and put it inside his jacket. He knew us both pretty well, Walt said. She looked up at him. He knew you better. He considered this. Maybe. He knew you longer. She thought about this with the seriousness she brought to everything. Duke knew him too, she said. Walt looked at the dog. Duke looked back at him with those steady dark eyes that had looked back at him for 3 years through training operations and deployments and the slow, difficult work of becoming a civilian again, and now looked back at him across a clearing in Montana that was full of people and books and the smell of coffee and cut pine. Yeah, Walt said, he did. Nora reached down and put her hand on Duke's head. She looked at the gathered people in the clearing at the shelter, in the runs, and the sign on its 2 posts at the entrance. She looked at the flat stone where the metal box had been buried and where the photograph had been waiting for her to find it. She turned to Walt. I want to read the letter, she said, the one from Dad, the one to me, out loud. He looked at her. To everyone. She looked at the people in the clearing. She nodded. Walt called for quiet, which in Cedar Falls required only standing still and looking as though you had something to say. The conversation stilled. People turned. Cormac moved closer. Opal Carey set down her coffee cup. Dr. Marsh straightened up from where he had been crouched beside one of the runs. Nora stood at the center of the clearing on the ground between the flat stone and the entrance sign with Duke beside her and Scout sitting on her left, and the old gray-muzzled hound settled behind them both. She took Ray's letter from inside the weatherproof sleeve. She unfolded it. She read it the same way she did everything else, carefully and without performance. She read about the land in the dream and the animals that were like soldiers that didn't choose their battles but kept trying anyway. She read the part about wanting to build something worth leaving behind. She read the final paragraph, the one about not being alone. Her voice was steady through most of it. It wavered once near the end on the word alone, and then steadied again. When she reached the last line Ray had written, the one added in different ink at the bottom, she paused. The clearing was completely silent except for the sound of the creek and the movement of the breeze in the runs and the wind in the pine tops. She read it. If you ever find this place and there's a good man standing beside you, then everything worked out exactly the way it was supposed to. She folded the letter. She looked at Walt. He nodded. The clearing was quiet for a moment longer, and then it was not quiet anymore because 30 people from Cedar Falls began to do what people do when something true has been said in their presence, which is to let it land and be affected by it without apology. Cormac Dolan looked at the ground and then at the sign and then at the ground again. Opal Carey had a hand pressed flat against her sternum. Ruth Maynard from the diner was smiling and not trying particularly hard to manage the fact that her eyes were bright. The Voss brothers stood side by side with their arms crossed, both looking at the mountains, which Walt had come to understand was the Cedar Falls equivalent of being openly moved. Later, after the afternoon had gone to early evening and most people had drifted back toward town, Walt and Nora were the last 2 left in the clearing. The dogs were settled in the shelter for the night. Scout had claimed a corner near the back where the hay was deepest and was already asleep. The gray-muzzled hound lay in the center of the main run with the immovable solidity of a creature that has finally found a floor it trusts. Duke was the only one still outside, lying on the flat stone as the last light moved across the clearing and the shadows of the pines stretched long and blue across the ground. Nora was sitting on the stone beside him. She had her notebook open on her knee and she was drawing the pencil, moving in those quick, precise strokes, and Walt stood a few feet away and looked at what she was drawing. It was the clearing, not as it had been in the photograph when she was 3 years old, not as it had been when they found it buried under decades of snow and neglect. As it was right now, the shelter and the runs and the fences, the sign at the entrance, the stone in the center, the mountains at the edge faint and suggested rising behind the tree line. She was drawing it the way it had become. Walt looked at it for a moment, then looked up at the real version, at the fence posts standing straight in the early spring ground, and the structure Cormac had built that would stand through many Montana winters, and the sign bearing the name of a family that had been part of this valley before any of them were born. He thought about Ray's voice on the ship in the dark, describing this place with the specific reverence of someone describing something they were afraid to lose. He thought about how Ray had known the whole time that the place he was describing would survive him, Had known it because he had found the person he trusted with it and had spent years making sure that person understood without being told directly what was going to be needed. The mountains at the edge of the valley were going dark now, the last of the light leaving the upper ridges. The sky above them was deepening from pale blue into something richer, and the first few stars were appearing above the eastern peaks, faint and tentative. Nora looked up from her drawing. She looked at the sky for a moment, and then she looked at Walt. He was right, she said, about the mountains. Walt looked at them. He thought about the line in Ray's letter. The look on your face when you tried to imagine it. I hope it's better than you imagined. Yeah, he said. He was. She looked back at her drawing. The pencil moved again, adding the detail at the bottom corner of the page. Walt leaned slightly to see. She had drawn Duke on the stone, lying in the sunlight, the way he had been lying all afternoon. She finished the line and closed the notebook. Duke lifted his head from the stone and looked at both of them with the calm, steady attention of an animal that has completed something it was meant to complete and is now at rest. The clearing settled into the long Montana evening. The pines stood in their ranks along the perimeter, the same as they had always stood through all the seasons and all the years when this land had been empty and all the years before that when it had held a family. The flat stone at the center held the last of the day's warmth. Walt put his hands in his coat pockets. He stood in the clearing that his friend had described on a ship in the middle of the ocean in the dark, to a young man who was trying to imagine a place he had never been. It was better than he had imagined. He had not managed to say this to Ray when Ray was alive, had not known yet that it would be true, had not understood, until he was standing in it, that the place had always been real, had always been waiting, had always been exactly what Ray said it was. He said it now quietly to no one in particular, and to the one person in particular who would have most wanted to hear it. It's better, he said. The evening was still and cold and full of stars. Nora stood up from the stone and tucked her notebook inside Ray's coat. She looked at the sign one more time, the carved letters in the Douglas fir, the name that had belonged to this land before either of them were born and would belong to it long after. She reached out and took Walt's hand. He looked down at her. She was not looking at him. She was looking at the mountains the way the people of Cedar Falls looked at the mountains when they meant something they did not have words for. He held her hand. Duke came off the stone and walked to them and stood between them, and the three of them remained in the clearing as the last light left the sky and the stars came fully out above the valley, more stars than most people ever see, the kind that make the world feel very large and very close at the same time. A promise had been kept. A dream had been built from the ground up, board by board, and fence post by people who showed up because the work was right. A girl who had chosen silence had found her way back to her own voice, not because the world had become less difficult, but because something in the clearing had been worth speaking for. And the man who stood beside her had done what Ray had always known he would do. He had stayed.